Thank you, Professor Bukter. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you and with our contestants and our participants and our judges and of course our audience, both live and virtual. It's really an honor for me to be chosen to be today's keynote speaker for the third annual competition for social impact investing done by the Fowler Center. I'm really delighted to be part of this effort. I've been a real fan of social impact investing for pretty much the length of my legal career. So it's delightful to be here. So Professor Bukter, if we can get started with the slide deck. Well, as I said, welcome everyone. Next slide, please. So the way basically what we're going to do today is we're having the competition from our 8 distinguished teams. It's very exciting. We also have a very distinguished panel of judges from both private sector as well as academia. I've been a member of the Fowler Center Planning Committee along with Professor Bukter and also a distinguished former colleague, Ayushee Agarwal, who will be joining us a little bit later. So following my remarks and a short interview with Dr. Ayushee, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So welcome everyone and good luck to the teams. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be altogether familiar with what social impact investment is, let me give you a quick overview. So an impact investment is simply a financial investment into companies or organizations or specific investment funds with the intention of not only making a financial return, meaning a profit on that investment, but also generating certain agreed to social, environmental, and other types of governance impacts. So what happens in this case is that the impact investor is prioritizing the achievement of environmental or social goals above making an investment profit. But that's not to say that profits are not important. They are interested in that too, but they're sort of prioritizing the achievement of these goals first. And that in itself represents sort of a revolution in investments as they're done now. So what happens essentially is in terms of determining these specific social, environmental, and governance goals, they are basically the subject of a great deal of discussion and a great deal of agreement as well as disagreement. But essentially what these goals are is that they aim for environmental goals such as, stopping, correcting climate change effects, social goals such as, women's empowerment, greater equity, greater access to capital from underserved communities, and governance goals that touch on, anti-corruption initiatives. So these innovative financing techniques also establish new legal models that help create development projects that reach out to neglected communities, both in the US as well as overseas. So some examples of impact investment projects come from example, the field of healthcare, global healthcare, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, along with Gavi, which is a global vaccine alliance, are early pioneers that sought innovative ways to pool resources from both private and public financial sources to improve and provide access to healthcare and especially immunizations. They've been on the forefront with regard to the COVID pandemic, for example. Next slide. So today's competition takes this sort of ESG as it's known, environmental, social, and governance impact. So they're taking this ESG-oriented focus and also aligns itself with UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So the linkage between ESG and also the SDGs, I know that's a lot of letters out there, was really a really good linkage, I think. The SDGs that were promulgated by the UN are aimed at the elimination of extreme poverty worldwide. The SDGs were adopted by the UN in 2015, and they have a target of achieving all of these goals by 2030. So with the overall goal of eliminating extreme poverty, the SDGs are also a complex compilation of many different supporting goals, and we'll talk about what those goals are. But these 17 goals are very much interrelated and also very ambitious. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of what the goals are. You can see that they are quite extensive and they're quite ambitious. I'll just give you a few points. Number 2 is, zero hunger. Number 3 is good health. Number 6 is clean water. Number 14 is life below the water. You can see that these are really overall very ambitious goals and very interesting and very complex. And there's 17 of them. So next slide, please. For this competition for today, the Fowler Center has chosen 6 goals that the contestants will be essentially working on. They can choose one or more, I suppose. So the first, just to go over it very carefully, is no poverty. The second is good health and well-being. The third is quality education. The fourth is gender equality. The 7th is affordable and clean energy. And the 6th is climate action. So these correspond to SDGs 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 13. And I think that the fact that the Fowler competition chose 6 SDGs for the teams to choose from was a very good idea, because it kind of narrows the field somewhat. I mean, 17 goals is really quite overwhelming. So I think narrowing it down to 6 potential SDGs for the teams to take a look at and develop their projects around was a good idea. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of sort of the impact of impact investing, if I can call it that, just to give you a market view. According to a 2020 survey that was done by the Global Impact Investing Network, GIIN, I don't know if some of you may have heard of it, the global impact investing market size is 715 billion worldwide. And this is from 2020, so this is basically sort of a pre-COVID sort of estimate. And after a decade, the 2020 Impact Investor Survey found that there were the highest number of respondents for the past 10 years. So they basically got responses from almost 300 global impact investors with a collective $404 billion worth of impact investing assets under management. So as you can see, in terms of the market share, impact investment is really important, and it's really a growing field. I mean, $404 billion worth of assets just in the last 10 years is really quite impressive. And let's just keep in mind that impact investment is qualitatively different from regular, what we think of traditional portfolio investment, where the stockbroker or the financial advisory firms make selections for a private investor. And a private investor could also be an institutional investor, such as a pension plan or an insurance company. So the difference between the two is that impact investment is intentional, meaning that the investor, whether it's an individual or an institution, is focused on achieving certain ESG or SDG goals. So that's not to say that the impact investor is not interested in any sort of profit making, or is simply saying, I don't care if we make profit, this is basically a grant, you can use the money for your project. That's not the case. They are interested in profit, but they are basically saying to the project, to the participants in whatever the investment project is, yes, we want to achieve these goals first, and we will wait for profit if it takes longer. So next slide, please. The next thing I'd like to look at is trends in impact investment. So there are certain important patterns that are emerging at this point. Many impact investors are applying a gender lens focus. So that means that they're basically including women and girls in their investment plans. So the focus on women and girls, I think, is very, very important, so that they're providing for education, including business education. They're providing for expanded markets, new client bases, new ways of marketing technology, and new ways of accessing capital. So including women and girls in the thinking and the planning around these investment strategies, I think, is a very important trend. Another trend that I'd like to bring to your attention is the interest in addressing and mitigating climate change. In my view, climate change is the existential threat of our generation. It requires a lot of disciplined thinking as well as investment to move away from the incredibly negative impacts of climate change that are a worldwide phenomenon. So the fact that climate change objectives are being integrated into investment impact planning is, I think, a very important trend. And thirdly, what we see now is the use of technology to make impact investment more inclusive, more accessible, and cheaper. So financial tools, it's actually called financial technology, or fintech for short, uses digital platforms, mobile banking, blockchain technology, and other sorts of expanded internet-based tools to make financial resources available to underserved communities. So just think the last time you used Amazon, or you bought something from Walmart, or you downloaded a program or an app, those are all examples, or you did your banking through a mobile app for your bank. Those are all examples of using financial technology for capital access, as well as access to new markets and new investors. And so what this does essentially, because it is internet-based, it levels the playing field, and it encourages the participation of disadvantaged individuals, communities, and countries in the global marketplace. So I see fintech as a way of moving sort of the global market forward in very impactful and very important ways. So it's another trend that we should keep in mind in terms of moving forward into impact investing for 2022. So hopefully with all of these new initiatives and all of this new energy, impact investing will be an integral part of the commitment to end extreme poverty by 2030. Next slide. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank you so much for your participation and your interest in this 2022 competition hosted by the Fowler Center. I'm very honored to be a part of this effort. If you'd like to reach out to me about the slides or anything I've discussed or anything in general, I may be contacted by the following in terms of my email and my LinkedIn profile. I hope you will look me up and reach out. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I am Ayushee, and I'm a fellow at Fowler Center. I would like to thank Professor Rumu on behalf of Fowler Center for taking out time and enlightening all of us here with her address. Impact investing is an emerging field, and a lot of us present here are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Through our address also, it's pretty interesting to see that how these sustainable development goals have a direct relation with this upcoming field of impact investing, and how these goals can help, and how the field of impact investing can help attain the objectives under these SDGs. Through this competition, we have got an opportunity to actually familiarize students with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also about the emerging field of impact investing. It was interesting to hear from through you about the growing market size of impact investing and what are the various professional avenues for our students. There have been enough studies, Professor Rumu, which actually prove and evidence that a lot of millennials now want to have a career which has a direct impact with environment, which has a direct social and environmental impact. So this field is particularly interesting. And then when you mentioned that the current impact investment assets under management right now are like 400 billion plus, it's pretty interesting to see that it gives an opportunity for us, for the upcoming students, to create a career opportunities over there. Thank you also for differentiating between a much confused terminology, which is philanthropy is a lot of times confused with impact investing. Thank you so much for just enlightening us that it's pretty different from impact investing, which is an investment with a financial return, but also making sure that we have on-ground impact in terms of environment as well as social. It's an honor to just be present here and to just pick your brains. And I want to take this opportunity to ask a few questions from you. Can you share what course are you currently teaching at CASE, and how is this impact investing associated or included in your course?
Well, thank you for the question, Ayushee. I'm a new professor at Case Western's Law School. I've joined their adjunct law faculty just this year, but I'm not new to being a law professor itself. I was a long-time adjunct law professor at Georgetown. In fact, I'm in Washington, D.C., so I'm teaching this course virtually. But essentially, the course that I'm teaching is the one that I've been teaching for many years at this point, International Development Law. So it's also based on a textbook that I've written with the same title. So what I've done based on my actual field experience being in the field of international development is to create a course that has two different kinds of approaches. One is sort of the philosophical and historical and human rights underpinnings to international development as a subject in law. And the second half really deals with international development in terms of how it's being done in the real world globally. So that basically means that I talk a lot about financing, because unless you have financing for international development, it won't occur. I mean, you can have the best laws, you can have, the best judiciary, you can have the best roads, but, if you don't have, the sort of impact environment that investors are looking for, development won't happen. So in my course at Cases going to law school, I've been basically teaching them about international development law. We're just about halfway through the course at this point. And I've also embedded an impact investment module into my course. It's a fact pattern that deals with ocean conservation. So my students will have to look at the fact pattern, look at the questions I've asked, design a project, fill out what's called a model term sheet, which we can talk about later, and then present their findings in class. So I'm hoping that it'll be a really exciting way of my students to approach the subject and become more interested in it, maybe as practitioners when they become lawyers themselves.
It's very interesting to see that how you have interwoven impact investing in your course, and it is so interesting and useful even for the law students. Like, we are here at the business school. It's very, very directly related to business students also, but I think this field is very much applicable even for the law students as well.
Oh, yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, the whole idea behind impact investing is it is multidisciplinary, which is one of the reasons I was so pleased, so honored to be able to work with you in the business school and I'm in the law school, because I think that the interrelationship between law and business in the field of impact investment is critical. Because you need all kinds of specialties, not just project designers and project implementers, but you need investors, of course, you need investment banking specialists, lawyers, accountants, NGOs that are able to do, evaluations of how successful the project was, both sort of as it's being implemented and at its termination point. So it's a collection, it's a collaboration between many different kinds of fields, but a collaboration, between the law school and the business school at this stage is very exciting. And I'm hoping at some point my own law students will participate in the competition in the coming years. And, we can forge, a closer relationship between the two schools. That would be very exciting.
We would love to have more participants, and especially like if law students also participating in this competition, we would love to have them too. My next question is about so our competition guide actually shared a rubric of due diligence, listing out few parameters which are taken into consideration by the impact investors when they take an impact decision. I would like to hear from you that what, according to you, are some of the important factors or important parameters that impact investors particularly look when they're making an investment decision?
That's a very interesting question, and it requires a somewhat complicated answer because the nature of impact investment is itself very complex. And that's one of the market barriers. It is a very complex undertaking, but you have to look at the parties involved. It's not just simply, okay, you have an investor who has money to invest in a particular project. It's not that simple, because what happens is that you have a number of investors, because what social impact investment is doing primarily, it's addressing a market failure. In other words, there's some sort of problem in terms of access to capital. Either the borrowers, end users such as villagers, farmers, fishermen, small mom and pop stores, people in the gig economy and the informal economy are not seen as credible risks. They're not seen as credible credit risks, so they don't have access to formal bank loans and that sort of thing. So what a lot of impact investment does is that it pools different sources of capital together, and they can be sourced from different parties, which makes the investors a very complex picture. You're not dealing with one profile. So on the one hand, you may have parties who are interested in just giving grant money. So this could be, someone like USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, Spoiler alert, I was a lawyer there for many years. Or it could be the World Bank, it could be other bilateral donors, the Danes, the French, the Germans, etc., the Japanese, who want to make grant funding available. You also have foundations, as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, philanthropic capital, and they may be interested in giving grant money as well for training, for, forming businesses, formally registering businesses, that sort of thing. So you may have grant capital that's very important, but you also need loan capital. So the parties that are interested in giving loans, again, are bilateral and multilateral investors, such as the World Bank and USAID and others. They're able to give loans, but they're also commercial actors. They're also commercial banks who are interested in financing some of these social impact ventures. But the difference is, for them, a return on their investment is usually a much higher priority than it is for other kinds of actors, such as USAID or other philanthropic donors who are basically prioritizing the achievement of ESG goals over the achievement of a profit margin. Not that the profit isn't important, but it may be secondary in importance. So you have this process where NGOs primarily, or actors who are actually facilitating the deal, are combining, in fact, it's called blended finance. They're combining concessional capital, which is a mix of grant and sort of partial credit guarantees, maybe risk insurance. They're combining sort of concessional capital along with commercial capital. And that's a very complex legal process to structure the special purpose vehicles, to structure the underlying legal agreements, to have a stream of financing that meets the objectives of the individual investors. So in other words, when you look at, someone, let's say Morgan Stanley has a client that's interested in doing this kind of a project, their timeline and their interest in terms of achieving the ESG goals or the SDG goals and achieving a profit may be very different from the World Bank's timeline. So the compilation of all of those actors, their priorities, their financing, their interest in achieving certain international development goals itself in terms of the project achieving its stated goals are very different. They differ greatly. So combining all of that is a really a long, complicated process. And so in terms of your ultimate question in terms of due diligence, this is where the rubber meets the road. As a friend of mine likes to say, this is exactly where due diligence comes into play, because all of these investors, whether they're public investors or private investors or philanthropic investors, are going to look very carefully at the terms of the deal. And that's why in my own class, for my own students, I'm having them do a model term sheet, which is a sort of a little outline of what the project will look like, what the loans or the guarantees will look like, what the tenures are, what the interest rates are. It's a little cheat sheet, if you want to call it that. That is where all of these investors come together and they try to come to, a final sort of closure. In fact, it's called a closing. They try to find a closure where all the parties can agree to the terms of the actual project, and that's a very long, difficult, very complicated process. But it's something that's really gaining traction, as you can see by the increased market share of social impact investment right now globally.
Thank you so much for such a detailed answer and for clearly kind of taking us through that how philanthropic capital would be different from a commercial capital, and also just putting out that how impact investing could be different from a financial investing or a regular or a normal or a commonly known investing.
Right.
So thank you so much for that. And it's very interesting to even know that how there are like so many factors that are involved, be it the legal structure, be it the due diligence, be it the management team, and how to kind of like structure the whole investment vehicle regarding that. So thank you so much. That's a pretty interesting answer. And I'm sure like whoever is present and like listening this and our students have like a lot to learn from this. My next question would be like in your slide, you did mention one or two examples about impact investors. Gavi was one. Can you also take us through like some other example where the impact is meeting and we are also achieving the sustainable development goal?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there's so many social impact vehicles that are out there, not just originating from the United States, but all over the world. And that's one of the most exciting things about this field, is that it's so diverse and it's so dynamic. It's really, really interesting. But there's so many different kinds of vehicles, I don't even know where to start. But there are a couple of projects that did really attract my attention. In terms of the environmental area or the climate change area generally, There's something called green bonds, which are forestry bonds or, natural habitat protection bonds, which is a very interesting vehicle that sort of protects and looks at protected areas and forests and carbon capture and that sort of thing. They're also called blue bonds, which deal with ocean conservation and, sort of habitat protection and cleaning up the oceans and waterways. And those are sometimes structured as what are called blue bonds. And one was done in Belize quite recently that also involved the debt for nature swap. So they would take the dollar-denominated debt of the Belize government, buy it up, and essentially through, again, this consortium of investors, buy up the debt, and then have the government release a local currency that's programmed into foundations that are basically designed to do all sorts of ocean conservation activities. So that's very exciting. But the one thing that I actually took a closer look at, I've been aware of it for quite some time, but I took a closer look at it over the weekend, is something called the Women's World Banking Livelihood Bank. Now, WWB, Women's World Banking, is an NGO that's located in New York City. And what they did in terms of this Women's Livelihood Bond is that they devoted $8 million in a 4-year bond, an actual bond, like you would buy in a mutual bond market, for example. And they created a consortium of blended finance with many different actors from Germany, from the United States. So they had a combination of concessional capital, what we call sort of loans that are made on a concessional basis, either with lower interest rates or longer tenures, longer time periods to repay the loan. So they combine concessional capital with commercial capital, which comes from private banking entities. And so what they did is that because this was a women's livelihood bond, it was really heavily and almost exclusively focused on women's empowerment, so that women who are major bread earners in many parts of the developing world were able to have access to capital to create their businesses and make them fully sustainable, and also expand them so they could start saving money for their children, going to school, exploring new client bases. And so what was really interesting to me, aside from the very complex structure of this bond offering, is that it made the final leap. All of the discussions that we've had up to this point has really been about private interventions. These are all private projects that are done by NGOs or private entities using public entity money, such as USAID money or World Bank money or other kinds of public sources of money. But essentially, these are all private projects. But for the Women's World Banking Livelihood Bond, it was actually listed as a commercial bond on the Singapore Stock Exchange. And to me, that is really an exciting development, because that shows that these kinds of social impact investments, even though they are very complex vehicles, are now becoming mainstream. They will essentially be listed on stock exchanges. And let me just take a moment to explain why that's so important in terms of a movement forward. At this point, there are basically two kinds of investments, just broadly speaking. There's foreign direct investment, which is what we've been talking about up to this point. But there's also something called foreign portfolio investment. And that's where you get, that's a secondary capital market. Primary market is, foreign direct investment. You have these private projects financed by different actors. But the foreign portfolio investment is considered the secondary market for capital investment. And that's where essentially stocks and bonds are listed on the stock exchange. As we all know, there's the New York, the London, the Paris, the Singapore, the Tokyo. There are lots of stock exchanges globally. But when you start listing these social impact projects and these bonds and these other financial vehicles on stock exchanges, that means you can attract portfolio investors. And that doesn't just mean, pension plans or retirement funds or insurance companies. That means, just retail portfolio investors. So if you have a 401k, you will now have access at some point to these social impact bonds when they start getting listed more broadly. And what, the private investor, whether it's just somebody who just has a retirement fund, a 401k or some other sort of retirement fund, they are now in a position, as I have done actually, to basically direct that I want all investments in my portfolio to be ESG oriented. I no longer want any investments in any companies or bonds that, for example, deal with fossil fuels. I just made that decision myself. But that's something that is now becoming accessible to every investor, wherever they are and however big or small their portfolio is. So the Women's World Banking Livelihood Bond really attracted my attention for that reason. There was a follow-up bond that they did starting in 2018, and they're working on a climate change or a climate control fund as well that they're working on currently. And to me, that is really exciting because I think that ultimately this will become the new normal. This will become the way in which business is done. So that even now considering ESG factors or SDG factors is considered cutting edge, and you have to be very, aware of, sort of becoming a good global citizen before you make those types of investments. I think over the next decade, and don't hold me to this prediction, but I'm hoping at least that over the next decade, everything will be SDG oriented in terms of investments, whether they're private, portfolio, foreign direct investment, whatever kind of investment they are, they will all take SDG factors into account.
And I think it's a very welcoming and very interesting move that not just the individual investors, like we hear about a business roundtable conference where Fortune 500 companies are also kind of pledging that wherever they would be investing would have an ESG impact attached to it. So I think like you said, and green bonds being listed on a Singapore stock exchange is just like such a huge welcome step. So we can see this whole field of impact investing in itself is not just growing, but it's like really growing by strides. So I think it just like poses a great amount of opportunity for the new professionals. And I think for a better world, that's more important. Yeah.
Yes, actually, it's so exciting because this means that, social impact investing is coming of age in a sense. Because, if you want to invest in a World Bank project, guess what? You can't.
Right.
It's meant for countries. It's meant for bilateral donors.
Government. Yeah.
It's meant for institutional investors. You can't just approach it saying, oh, this World Bank project really interests me. I really want to contribute to it. It's not possible, at least not now. But if these bonds are listed, on stock exchanges so that they become accessible internationally to a much wider range of investors, that's wonderful. And in fact, what's also happening is crowdsourcing. They're using the crowdsourcing vehicle to source monies that will be lent out for social impact investment projects, but there's crowdsourcing it just like you would on GoFundMe. I'm not saying GoFundMe is involved in social impact investment, but I'm saying it's that sort of vehicle. There are all sorts of crowdsourcing platforms that are opening up that are directed towards doing these kinds of social impact investments. So it's all very dynamic, very interesting.
And very exciting, right? Very exciting. I think the more the awareness, like this awareness is kind of driving the growth of impact investing space. And let's see how the future holds. So it's pretty interesting. Okay, just like wrapping up, and my last question to you would be like, what would be some resources or what would be your suggestions for anyone who is trying to start up a career in this space, or for an aspiring students? Like a lot of our students, be it law students or business students, they just get a flavor of this space through this competition and during their school time. But once you graduate, you're out in the industry. So what are those imperative skills that you think are important for someone starting out in this space?
Well, I would advise them to do exactly what I've been doing. What I've been doing is that I've been choosing social impact investment NGOs and other sorts of training institutes to learn more about how to do it as a lawyer. What are the different trends? Who's done really interesting deals? So I can't sort of give you a laundry list of sites because there's just too many of them and people have different interests. But I would say start with exploring the internet. There's just tremendous amounts of materials and education and groups of people who are talking to each other about all kinds of social impact projects and vehicles and different approaches. So I would start there. But for Case Western students more generally, there is the Beale Institute for Entrepreneurship, which has a lot of resources available to students. I'm not working with them directly. I'm not familiar with their programs exactly, but I know that they're there. And I would encourage all Case Western students who are interested in the area of impact investment to look at the Beale Institute to see what resources they may have to offer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Rumu. Like not just for your time, but I want to thank you on behalf of Fowler Center for your phenomenal support throughout this competition, in helping us planning it, in helping us sharing your thoughts, and in also sharing your insights about this whole space. So thank you so much, and good luck to all the teams. Let's just wait for the results. Wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayushee.